It's midnight. The desert is cold, the stars are silent, and a man with a torn heart reaches for his harp. This is not a concert. It's a cry. And the angels are listening. Welcome to Midnight Psalms, where sacred whispers echo through sleepless nights. If you've ever worshipped with tears or prayed with no words left to speak, this space is for you. It wasn't just any night. It was one of those nights where the soul refuses to sleep. The kind where the weight of guilt, the ache of loss, and the silence of heaven all press in at once. David sat alone outside the cave while his men slept inside. His hands trembled not from the cold but from memories. A king who had once danced with joy was now a fugitive in the dark. The moon hung heavy in the sky as if heaven itself was holding its breath. He didn't reach for a sword. He didn't call for revenge. He reached for his harp. Strings worn would cracked, but still it sang. Not to entertain, but to survive. David knew something most warriors didn't, that in the darkest hour, songs could do what swords never could. He began to play, each note soaked in sorrow and hope, each chord a question tossed toward the stars. "Why are you silent, Lord?" he whispered. "Why do you hide when I need you most?" The wind rustled the trees and somewhere far off, a jackal howled. But David stayed still. His voice low, raw, "I said in my haste, I am cut off from before your eyes. Nevertheless, you heard the voice of my supplication when I cried out to you." His fingers tightened. This wasn't performance. This was survival. His harp was his weapon. His lyrics a lifeline. Even when heaven seemed closed, David sang his way to God. The psalm wasn't written with ink first. It was written with tears. Every word poured from a heart undone. He remembered the shame with Bathsheba, the betrayal of his own son, the innocent blood, the haunting guilt, but still he sang. "Create in me a clean heart, O God. Renew a right spirit within me." Not because he felt clean, but because he was drowning. And sometimes the only way to breathe again is to write a psalm in the dark. He wasn't trying to impress God. He was trying not to disappear. David's psalms weren't polished prayers. They were messy cries, honest, bare, full of contradictions, praise and panic, worship and questions. They weren't Sunday morning songs. They were midnight confessions. And maybe that's why God loved them. Because they weren't fake. They were faithful in their pain. Out there in the night, David began to remember, not his failures, but God's faithfulness. The lion, the bear, the giant, the oil on his head, the promises. Yes, he had fallen, but God had followed him into the dark, and that changed everything. "Even if I make my bed in hell, you are there." That's not poetic. That's a man who's lived both the palace and the pit. As the stars shifted and dawn crawled toward the horizon, David wrote not just for himself, but for all of us. For the broken, the ashamed, the ones who failed big but still long to be found. Every verse was a rope thrown into tomorrow, a reminder that even in the cave, God listens. Even in the wilderness, God speaks. And even when we don't feel him, he's closer than breath. This psalm wasn't for a choir. It was for the crushed. It wasn't sung in a temple. It was wept into the wind. But heaven caught it. Because when you cry at midnight, angels don't sleep. And when you write in the valley, the mountain starts to move. That night, David didn't get all the answers. But he found something deeper. Presence. Peace. Not because the situation changed, but because he remembered who still sat on the throne. So if tonight you find yourself with a pen in hand and tears on your cheeks, write, sing, pray. Not because you're strong, but because that's where God meets you. Not in the mask, but in the mess. That's the secret David knew. That's why even when he fell, he was still called a man after God's own heart. Because when others ran from God in shame, David ran toward him in song. And maybe that's what faith looks like at midnight. Not loud declarations, but quiet surrender. Not perfect answers, but raw honesty. Maybe faith is picking up your harp when you feel disqualified. Maybe it's daring to sing even when your voice shakes. That's what David did. And it changed history. Not because he was strong, but because he was honest. David didn't wait to be whole before he worshipped. He worshipped so he wouldn't fall apart. That's a key only the broken understand. We wait for clarity. He offered confusion. We wait for peace. He brought chaos. And God accepted it, not as rebellion but as relationship. In that cave, his song was like incense rising in the darkness. Not because it was beautiful but because it was real. That's what makes midnight psalms powerful. They aren't pretty, they're pure. And that purity pierces heaven. While David wept, God leaned in. Not to judge but to join. That's the mystery. We think we need to climb to God. But often he descends to us, into the cave, into the pain, into the sleepless night. Because he's not a God of just the sanctuary. He's a God of shadows. A God who shows up when everyone else walks away. A God who turns broken songs into eternal scripture. David knew his psalm would outlive his pain. That night something shifted. The cave didn't become a palace. But his heart stopped running. His soul stood still. He didn't need everything fixed to believe again. He just needed to remember. The Lord is my shepherd. That wasn't written beside still waters. It was written while running from spears. But still, he believed. And so he sang. What's profound is this. The same harp that once played in Saul's palace now echoed in a hole in the earth. Same strings. Different setting. But same God. That's what makes worship so radical. It works in both thrones and caves. Because it's not about the place, it's about the presence. And David knew how to find him even in the shadows. Even when no one was watching. Even when shame screamed louder than hope. Sometimes our most powerful prayers aren't public. They're whispered between sobs. Written on the backside of heartbreak. That's where psalms are born, not in comfort but in conflict. That night, David wrote not from victory but from vulnerability. And that vulnerability became scripture. Became comfort. Became hope for generations of midnight souls who'd come after him. Souls like ours. So many think God only wants our best. But David proved otherwise. He gave God his worst. His fear, his failure, his weakness, and somehow, it became worship. That's the upside-down power of grace. It turns fugitives into psalmists. Exiles into examples. That night, David didn't ask God to remove the pain. He asked God to stay near inside it. And that's the kind of prayer God can't resist. The night finally began to break. The sky bled with light. But David stayed kneeling. Not because he was still afraid, but because something sacred had happened. He hadn't escaped Saul. But he had encountered God. And sometimes that's the greater victory. Not when circumstances change, but when we do. That cave became a cathedral. Not because of stone or gold, but because a broken man chose to worship anyway. And now, thousands of years later, his psalm still speaks. Still heals. Still reminds us, you're not alone. If you're in a cave, if the world feels cold, if your mistakes feel louder than your prayers, there's still a song in you. It doesn't have to be perfect. Just honest. Just offered. That's what makes it powerful. That's what makes it sacred. Your midnight can become a melody. So tonight, light a candle. Open the Psalms. Or write your own. Whisper to heaven like David did. You don't need a throne. Just a heart willing to be honest. A voice willing to speak when everything else says be silent. Because the God who met David in the cave is the same God who's waiting in yours. If this spoke to you, you're not alone. Subscribe to Midnight Psalms and join a quiet army of midnight worshipers. New videos weekly. Let your nights become sacred.